This episode of The History Guy is sponsored by ZocDoc.
Look, I'm old. The history guy has a lot of history. Sometimes things hurt. Sometimes I forget things. Is this mole cancer? Have you ever heard of cyberchondria? Talk about a new word for a new world. Cyberchondria is what happens when you are going to, say, Google a symptom. Say you have a rash, or maybe you keep forgetting your keys, and everything you find online only increases your anxiety. Pretty much all of us have fallen down the "is this going to kill me" late night doom scroll. Sitting up in bed instead of sleeping, desperately searching the web to see, is this mole cancer? How about if instead you just booked an appointment with a real doctor, someone that's in network, that has availability in the next day or two, someone who actually felt like the right fit? That's the beauty of ZocDoc. You don't have to wait for the office to open in the morning only to call and be put on hold. You can instantly book an appointment with a provider and then get a good night's sleep without that terrifying journey into cyberchondria. Using ZocDoc is free. Visit ZocDoc.com/thehistoryguy to find and instantly book an appointment with a provider who will listen, understand, and support you.
ZocDoc is a digital healthcare marketplace. Instead of random medical advice online, we're talking about being able to book in-network appointments with more than 150,000 providers, from primary care physicians to dermatologists, podiatrists to pediatricians, from over 200 specialties across all 50 states. I already have a doctor that I love, but I'm lucky and he wasn't easy to find. I would love to have had a tool like ZocDoc when I needed it, and now if I need something else, like say a dermatologist, is this mole cancer? ZocDoc does everything that you would want from this sort of service. The doctor's name, the location so I can see how far away they are, where they went to school, whether they're in my network, which is of course critically important, when their next appointments are available, or whether they take video appointments, how well recommended they are, how long the average wait time at the office is. Look, most people know more about the mechanic where they take their car than they do about their new doctor. ZocDoc fixes that.
And when you're ready to book, you can actually see their real-time availability online and instantly book an appointment. No phone tag, no waiting around. Appointments made through ZocDoc happen quickly, typically within 24 to 72 hours. You might even score a same-day appointment. So take that cyberchondria out of your search history. So visit ZocDoc.com/thehistoryguy to find and instantly book an appointment with a provider who will listen, understand, and support you. Using ZocDoc is free. In May of 1945, Germany surrendered, and for millions of American troops in Europe, many of whom had spent years fighting their way across the continent, that victory meant one thing: going home. But the war was still going on in the Pacific, and as Truman said on May 8th, that glorious hour was not the end, because, he said, our victory is but half won. But transferring resources from Europe to the Pacific was no mean task. At that point in the war, America was facing manpower shortages and war weariness and transportation difficulties that might undermine our ability to defeat Japan. The planned invasion of Japan would require millions of troops, many of whom would have to be transported from Europe. But just as the military needed these men, they began clamoring to go home.
General George C. Marshall, Chief of Staff of the United States Army, had witnessed the morale collapse after the ending of World War I, particularly between the time Germany asked for an armistice and actually signed a surrender. He was concerned that defeat of Germany would present a problem for victory in the Pacific. In 1943, he predicted that the collapse of Germany would impose partial demobilization and a growing impatience for troops to return home. Allied planners were in agreement that after the fall of Germany, Japan would need to be defeated quickly, or possibly not at all. In all, more than 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during World War II, with the bulk serving in the Army, which at its peak had over 11 million men and women in uniform. Germany and the Soviet Union faced severe manpower shortages throughout the war, eventually impressing both substantially older and younger men and boys to fill their units. The issue was less pronounced in the U.S. Armed Forces, but not insignificant. Rick Atkinson, in his book The Guns at Last Light, describes the situation in Europe in the last 2 years of the war succinctly. Between 1942 and 1944, the average GI was 26. But manpower demands in this global struggle meant the force was growing younger. Henceforth, nearly half of all American troops arriving to fight in Europe in 1944 would be teenagers. Physical standards had declined. By 1944, a man with 20/400 vision could be considered conscripted if they could correct the sight to 20/40 in one eye. And earlier in the war, recruits had to have at least 12 teeth. By 1944, teeth were no longer a requirement for service. Soldiers could be conscripted if they had only one eye, were deaf in one ear, or if they were missing a thumb or 3 fingers on either hand, including a trigger finger. Still, the United States never got close to truly running out of conscripts. The more serious issue was one of training replacement infantrymen. In February of 1944, Marshall discussed the issue of infantry replacements with Lieutenant General Leslie McNair. McNair reported that while infantry made up only 11% of the U.S. Army personnel fighting in Italy, they made up 60% of the total casualties. That number increased, and after D-Day, infantry casualties made up as much as 90% of total casualties. According to a 2020 article in the Military Review, without replacements, all 15 infantry divisions that landed at Normandy would have ceased to exist within 2 months. As the war continued, the shortages became only more acute, despite efforts to increase infantry recruitment. According to the National World War II Museum, on average, an infantry regiment sustained 100% casualties, meaning that the entire number of men in the regiment would have been replaced in only 3 months. By December of 1944, this meant a shortage of 23,000 men in the European theater. Thousands of replacements were found by retraining non-infantry soldiers for the infantry, including remarkably several thousand African-American soldiers from other parts of the service. Planners had failed to accurately estimate the casualty rates, assuming much smaller percentages. Training infantry replacements in the U.S. took 17 weeks, and even when that was shortened to 15 weeks, replacements couldn't come fast enough. The troops that did arrive were often undertrained and sometimes poorly fit, which hurt combat effectiveness. All this meant that by the time that the American planners were working on Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, manpower requirement estimates had changed significantly. By July of 1945, there were a total of 22 Army divisions and 6 Marine divisions, not to mention the huge numbers of Air Force and naval personnel, in the Pacific. At the same time, there were 62 U.S. combat divisions deployed in Europe, including 43 infantry divisions. According to the Naval History and Heritage Command, at the time Germany surrendered, the War Department envisioned a steady flow of GIs into the Pacific theater to force Japan to surrender in 1946. 400,000 soldiers were projected to sail directly from Europe to the Pacific, and hundreds of thousands more to be sent to the U.S. for retraining before redeployment to the Pacific. Planning envisioned 15 divisions to be redeployed to the Pacific theater, and the first actual shipment of soldiers left Italy on June 8th, arriving in Manila on July 15th. The 8th Air Force was also expected to be transferred to the Pacific. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, argued that no land invasion would be necessary and that Japan could be bombed into submission. On May 10th, only 2 days after Germany surrendered, the War Department announced the Adjusted Service Rating Score, a point system meant to make demobilization equitable. R-Day, or Redeployment Day, when the points were to be officially calculated, was scheduled for May 12th. Even with expected manpower needs in the Pacific, reports said that at least 1.3 million soldiers would be discharged. The point system only applied to enlisted men, not officers, and the Navy, including the Marines, delayed demobilization until after Japan's defeat. The War Department had been considering the problem of redeployment for some time. On September 6, 1944, they released the demobilization plan after defeat of Germany, which introduced the Adjusted Service Rating Card, with more specific rules for the system released in May of 1945. Initially, at least, reception of the plan was favorable, but soon families and upset soldiers began complaining. In January of 1944, the Army had begun developing a film with Army Colonel Frank Capra to explain the plan of demobilization, titled 2 Down and 1 to Go, shown to most soldiers shortly after Germany's surrender. The point system put European soldiers into 4 categories. Category 1, around 337,000 personnel, would remain in Europe. Category 2, around 1 million soldiers, would be redeployed to the Pacific. Category 3, units would be reorganized and retrained before being reclassified into 1 or 2. And Category 4, units that would be discharged. Points were awarded for months in service, with an extra point if the service was overseas. 5 points for combat awards, including medals like the Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart, and campaign participation stars, and 12 points for dependent children under 18 up to 3. Enlisted men initially needed 85 points to be demobilized. That didn't end criticism from the men scheduled to be reassigned to the Pacific. On May 11th, General Eisenhower released an order to all senior commanders of ground and air forces and also to divisional commanders in the entire European theater of operations, promising that we must be sure that no combat soldier is sent to the Pacific who has fought in both North Africa and Europe, writing that any soldier who had fought in both campaigns who lacked the necessary points should be kept in Europe for occupation service, as they should not be required to fight another campaign. Compounding resentment was that the whole point system, while it was meant to be fair, was an administrative nightmare. Bureaucracy struggled to award points accurately. Soldiers complained about the fact that new fathers, often recently arrived, got 12 points per child, when many of the soldiers figured that they'd have had kids too if they'd been at home instead of in Europe. A primary complaint was that the points didn't recognize combat exposure, so rear echelon troops got the same points frontline troops did. When the 101st Airborne was asked where they wanted to go after licking Germany, the soldiers answered unanimously, home. Waiting was half the problem. As the war continued in Europe, few ships were available to move large numbers of troops in Europe who now had nothing to do. Sergeant Gerald Rafferty complained how monotonous and pointless this whole existence over here has become. Administrative issues further hampered the proposed plans. Units were expected to be discharged or redeployed by division, which meant that some divisions would have their lower point soldiers transferred out to other divisions, while higher point soldiers were transferred in for discharge. The reshuffling was messy and uneven. But the 45th Division, despite having more than 11,000 soldiers eligible for discharge, more than two-thirds of the division's strength, was nonetheless scheduled for redeployment to the Pacific. Marshall would later complain that political and economic institutions melted out from under us after VE Day. The home front was demanding an end to wartime production, and Fred Vinson, director of the Office of War Mobilization and Reconversion, told the Joint Chiefs that he was afraid of unrest in the country, and that he had never seen the people in their present frame of mind. More unsettling was the condition of troops in the ETO. Secretary of War Henry Stimson got the impression from troops landing in Florida on their way to the Pacific that men were war-weary in a way no one merely reading reports could readily understand. Allied forces planned to begin their assault on Japan with an amphibious landing scheduled for November 1st, 1945, X-Day, on the island of Kyushu, dubbed Operation Olympic. Plans included a second landing in March 1946 on the largest Japanese island, Honshu, called Operation Coronet. More than 1.7 million American troops were to be committed in the attacks, as well as at least 5 divisions of British and Commonwealth troops. For soldiers in Europe, morale quickly dissolved. They knew that the fighting in the Pacific was different than Europe. A tropical climate, risk of disease, and the widespread understanding that the Japanese fought to the last man without surrender depressed soldiers who had, in the euphoria following VE Day, only been thinking of home. British troops redefined the acronym for the British Liberation Army, then fighting in Burma, to the Burma looms ahead. Trying to manage training new replacements, demobilization, and the redeployment amidst preparations for by far the largest amphibious invasion force in history pushed many Army resources to their limit. General George C. Marshall called redeployment the greatest administrative and logistical problem in the history of the world. The point system had weaknesses for Army preparedness as well, as troops were moved around in massive numbers to relieve whole divisions, and the most veteran soldiers were relieved of duty. Other issues focused on battle stars, which gave soldiers 5 points towards discharge. Eisenhower's chief of staff wrote that even before full details about the star system came out, he was receiving complaints from troops who said that they were getting a raw deal. The headaches about the campaign stars are just getting started, he wrote. Belated stars complicated an already unwieldy system. The 2nd Division, already slated for redeployment to the Pacific, had 2,700 soldiers suddenly made eligible for discharge when it was awarded 2 more campaign credits. According to Time, belated stars would exempt 14,000 men in the ETO from further service. The point system impacted Pacific units too. Divisions recovering from campaigns in the Philippines and scheduled for the first wave of the Japanese invasion were replenishing their units with raw recruits while simultaneously discharging as many as 23,000 soldiers had reached the 85-point minimum for discharge. Admiral Nimitz doubted that the Army would be ready for the scheduled November invasion. Admiral Ernest King needled General Marshall by reminding him that they needed more shipping in the Pacific because of the system of point discharges. Personnel needs for the invasion were complex enough without considering Japanese defense. There were few potential landing sites, so Japanese defensive planners were able to accurately predict the landing zones on the southern shore of Kyushu and the plains south of Tokyo on Honshu. As the months progressed, defensive forces amassed in Kyushu quickly outpaced initial estimates. Eventually, over 735,000 military personnel were present on Kyushu, which, according to MacArthur's intelligence chief, meant that opposing forces might grow to the point where we attack on a ratio of 1-to-1, which seemed to spell certain failure. American planners began seriously considering altering Olympic, or even scrapping the plans entirely in favor of something different, although MacArthur declared he didn't believe changes needed to be made and he did not credit reported strengths. The estimated cost in lives was huge, if also uncertain. Herbert Hoover, a close friend of Truman, suggested the invasion would cost between 500,000 and 1,000,000 American lives. General Marshall's chief of staff, Thomas H. Handy, disagreed, arguing that under our present plan of campaign, 500,000 was much too high an estimate. Casualties estimates for the Japanese were apocalyptic, assuming millions of deaths. Some Japanese sources were counting on the combination of grueling war and the promise of demobilization to convince the U.S. to be lenient in peace talks. Japanese intelligence argued that the bloody landings would decrease fighting morale among the American people and military. The stage seemed to be set for a horrifyingly bloody battle.
All those problems presented by redeployment and the planned invasion of the home islands and the complaints with the point system ended up being moot, as American planners turned instead to using nuclear weapons to compel Japan to surrender. The question of how the planned invasion of Japan would have gone or what strategies the military would have used never had to be answered. By August 25th, just days before the Japanese surrender, over 155,000 American troops had already been sent directly from Europe to the Pacific, and more than 800,000 had been sent to the United States en route to the Pacific, when the challenge for American military planners shifted to how to accomplish demobilization. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.